about the Texas state laws, as you can see, and feel free to ask questions as we go along. Hopefully you'll have some. I'm going to talk a little bit about how the state laws differ from the federal laws, because you heard that speaker earlier, and also talk about some of the industries that Cynthia talked about, because at one time or another, that laundry list of different types of companies that she had listed, we probably prosecuted in some form or fashion at one time or another. So, you know, there's civil enforcement in some cases, but there's also criminal enforcement. I only do the criminal. We have a county attorney's office in Harris County that does civil enforcement. We work with those groups as well. We work with the EPA. We work with the U.S. Attorney's Office. We work with the different task forces. And like when you were listening to the EPA agent, he was telling you that sometimes they'll bring cases and file state charges in the state courts, and that goes through our office to review and file. So we have lots of flexibility, lots of cooperation. But you know, for today, we're here to hopefully help you guys stay out of trouble. Because like one of the speakers said, if everyone that's in this room was in compliance, we would still have a ton of work to do. And right now, my desk is just full of case files that I still need to review, that I need to present to a grand jury for charges and then go to court on. So there's no shortage of environmental cases in Harris County. So hopefully my presentation will be productive to you. If you want to find all of these laws, you can go to, and they're all on the website, you can go to Chapter 7 of the Texas Water Code and find basically all of the environmental criminal laws in one chapter, in Chapter 7. That chapter is titled Enforcement, and then if you go to subchapter E, it's titled Criminal Offenses and Penalties. The preceding chapters deal with administrative enforcement, definitions, civil enforcement, injunctive relief, everything else. And then when you get to subchapter E, they talk about all the criminal offenses and penalties, and that's what I'm going to be talking to you about. First of all, what do we mean by water pollution? Well, it's defined by our legislature, and you can see here what we're talking about when we mean water or water in the state. And of course, it's going to have stuff in here that you would normally think of as water, including groundwater, lake space, ponds, etc. All other bodies of surface water, and it doesn't matter if it's natural or artificial. In other words, if you have a man-made pond on your property that you decide you don't want anymore, and you start putting material in it, any type of waste or pollutant to fill it in, let's say, that could be a crime, even though it's on your property. Because once you've made it, it becomes water in the state of Texas and cannot be polluted in any way without specific authorization. And usually to fill in a pond, you have to go to the Army Corps of Engineers and get their permission to do something like that. The other thing is where it says navigable or non-navigable. That's a difference between state and federal law. Under the Federal Clean Water Act, the body of water must be a navigable waterway or a tributary of a navigable waterway. Under Texas law, it doesn't matter. It can be a drainage ditch, it can be a storm sewer, it can be a non-navigable creek, a bayou, it just doesn't matter. It's all water in the state. And then this last part, it includes the beds and banks of all water courses. Well, when are you going to see the beds and banks of a water course? Who can tell me? When are you going to see the beds and bank of a water course? When it's dry, right? When we have drought conditions. Well, what they're telling us here, and we actually had a case that we prosecuted under this theory that was affirmed on appeal, it doesn't matter if there's any water in the body of water or not. In other words, if you have a dry riverbed and you introduce a waste or pollutant into that dry riverbed, that's water pollution. Why is that water pollution? Who can tell me? state law and federal law. We have these cases. Watts v. State held that drainage ditches were water in the state. And in that case, they held that it didn't matter if the ditch was dry or not. In Watts, he had a small mobile home park. The problem was that his septic system was old and didn't work very well anymore. So what he did was he dug trenches from each mobile home out to the drainage ditch in front of his property, such that when the residents flushed their toilets, the wastewater went into the trenches and ultimately into the drainage ditch. He was prosecuted for water pollution. His argument on appeal was that the drainage ditch was not water in the state. The Court of Appeals, in this case, the 14th District Court of Appeals, held that yes, in fact, because a drainage ditch is a waterway or a water course, it never loses its characteristic as a water course, so it didn't matter if it had any water in it or not. And they held, in that case, that drainage ditches were water in the state. In fact, if you go and look at that opinion, that you can also find online, it's volume, to know how to read that, it's volume 140 of the Southwest Reporter's 3rd edition on page 860, and you can find that case if you want to read it. But one of the interesting things that the 14th Court of Appeals did in that case, because it was a case of first impression to them, they did some research on the entire body of water law since Texas became a republic. And they went back to the 1800s and looked at some of the old decisions on water rights and different types of water in the state, and ultimately held that everything other than free-falling raindrops constitutes water in the state. And then once those raindrops hit the ground, they become water in the state. So virtually everything in Texas is water in the state. In McGee v. State, the first Court of Appeals held that sanitary sewer lines were water in the state. In that case, McGee was a vacuum truck driver, and he would go and clean out septic systems for a living. But instead of taking that septic waste to a proper disposal facility, he decided it would be a good idea to just pop a manhole in the city of Houston and just discharge his load there, thinking that, well, all that water is going to a treatment facility that's going to be treated anyway. The problem is that he was not authorized to do that, and that was considered an unauthorized discharge, and we charged him with water pollution. McGee's entire argument on appeal was that the water in a city sanitary sewer line was not water in the state. And on appeal, we argued that, well, if it's not water in the state, whose water is it? Who owns that water? And ultimately, the court held that it had to be water in the state because the city didn't own that water. They treated it, they collected it, but then they discharged it. And when it's discharged back into state waterways, into bayous and streams and creeks, etc. So in that case, they held that a sanitary sewer line was also water in the state. What do we mean by waste? All of these have, their own meaning. Of course, sewage is one of the common ones that we deal with. Any type of industrial waste. Probably, if your business here has any type of discharge at all, it's going to be considered industrial wastewater. It can be municipal waste, recreational waste, etc. Here's what we mean by industrial waste. Any waterborne liquid. It can be a gas or even a solid substance that results from any process of industry, trade, or business. So very all-encompassing, pretty much covers everything. Other waste, if we have to go to this category, you can see it covers a wide variety of things. One of the important ones for us is oil. We get a lot of oil discharges from different types of businesses, chemicals, any other substance, etc., that is a waste type material. So very broad definitions that the legislature has given us to work with. and what's being discharged isn't really a waste material at all. Maybe it originally was product, something happened, it gets discharged anyway, but it's still, depending on what it is, maybe a pollutant. And you can see that it means solid waste, garbage, chemical waste, biological materials, even heat can be a pollutant. Who can tell me why heat might be a pollutant? Kills wildlife. You know, if you discharge a heated material and there's enough of it, and you discharge it into the ship channel, you're going to have a massive fish kill as a result because of that heat. So they've listed that as a pollutant. And of course, then you've got industrial waste, etc. Anything that's discharged into any water in the state. And then pollution. This is a really important definition. If a case is worked by one of the HPD officers, one of the things that they always have to consider is whether or not the discharge at your facility, let's say, meets this definition of pollution. And when I'm reviewing a case for prosecution, I have to make sure that the facts that I have meet this definition of pollution. And as you can see, if you read it, it's one really long run-on sentence. And if you remember back in elementary school, English and grammar, where you had to go to the blackboard and diagram sentences, if you diagram this one, you can see there are several ways that pollution can be caused. It can be the alteration of the physical, thermal, chemical, or biological quality of water. That's one way. And by the way, what's the alteration of physical water? Who can tell me how you alter the physical state of water? You can freeze it. It can be a solid, liquid, or a gas, right? If you freeze it, you're changing the physical state. If you heat it up, you create steam, you change the physical state. The thermal, again, is pretty self-explanatory, and so is chemical and biological quality. The second way is if you just have the contamination of any water in the state. If we can show that that discharge rendered the water harmful, detrimental, or injurious to either humans, animal-like vegetation, or property, or to public health, safety, or welfare. And then the last way you can have pollution is if that discharge just impairs the usefulness or public enjoyment of the water for any lawful or reasonable purpose. So as you can see, several ways that we can meet this definition of pollution, but we must meet it in some way in order to prosecute someone or an entity for water pollution.